The Rough Country 1-inch leveling kit that we have here today will be a great low-key option for any 21 and newer Bronco owner who might be looking to level out the stance a little bit more and make more room for a larger set of tires. Now, the Rough Country kit will include spacers for both the top and bottom of the front strut assembly and can be had for right around $75. Now, install according to the site, it's going to get a solid 2 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. Take a couple of hours to remove both front strut assemblies and then reinstall them. But if you hang with me for a bit, guys, we'll walk you through that job later in the video. So again, this is a solid option for all Bronco owners out there, even including the Badlands and Sasquatch owners, to get that front end a little bit higher, give you more ground clearance in. At the end of the day, give you a little bit more room for a 35-inch tire with full articulation. Now, with this kit installed, the truck is essentially nice and level, and say essentially because the rear is still going to be 1/4 of an inch higher than the front from our measurements, which is pretty much what you want. You don't want it to be completely level, and you certainly don't want the front end to be a little bit higher than the rear, because it just kind of looks goofy and ultimately doesn't give you the best performance. Now, obviously, this isn't going to deliver a massive change in stance like a 2 or 3-inch lift kit would, but if you have a Badlands or a Sasquatch Bronco with the Haas suspension and those Bilsteins, then you can't just go slapping on a 2-inch kit or higher, as it will mess with the position-sensitive damping of those particular trucks. So again, at the time of this video, if you have a Badlands or a Sasquatch rig, this is really one of your only options that will still play nice with those factory-equipped Bilsteins. But once installed, this kit will easily make room for a 33-inch tall tire, even a 35-inch tire with full articulation and, of course, those crash bars removed. Now, you can get a 37 underneath the truck with this kit installed. However, I would not advise it for any hardcore off-road use, as the limited space with the limited lift will certainly cause some rubbing issues under full articulation. Now, like most leveling kits out there, the Rough Country 1-inch option is going to incorporate spacers to help you achieve that 1 inch of leveling or lift in the front end. Now, unlike larger lift kits or leveling kits out there, this 1-inch option from Rough Country is going to utilize kind of a two-pronged approach, if you will, to help you achieve that lift. You have a smaller set of spacers up top measuring in at just about 1/4 of an inch, along with the smaller spacer on the bottom of the strut assembly, and that's going to measure about 1/8 of an inch. Now, altogether, that will equal the 1 inch of leveling for the front end when combined. Now, the spacers themselves have been made from a very durable, thick steel construction, and they have been finished off in a textured black powder coat just to help reduce or prevent any corrosion over the years. As you can see, they also kick in some new hardware here, including lower strut mount bolts. This is huge because, believe me when I tell you guys, you are absolutely gonna beat the crap out of your lower bolts. You might even mess them up, as we have in the past. So the fact that they give you some new bolts along with some new nylock nuts and some other hardware, certainly big thumbs up from me. Last but not least, guys, Rough Country kit is backed by a limited lifetime warranty, just in case you run into any issues. But now we want to shift gears and just show you what it takes to get the Rough Country kit in place. And to do so, I got my man Joe on the wrenches, ready to walk you through it, along with giving you a quick tool breakdown. Check it out.
The tools used for this install are an impact gun, an impact driver or ratchet, 6mm Allen, 8, 10, 18, 21, 24, and 36mm sockets, a hammer, a marker, a 21mm wrench or ratcheting wrench, a 24mm wrench, a 15mm ratcheting wrench, 18mm ratcheting wrench, 19mm ratcheting wrench, and 17mm ratcheting wrench, a torque wrench, a pry bar, and a caliper hanger tool. So for this leveling kit install, we are going to have to remove the knuckle and strut assemblies from our Bronco. It's not a very difficult process, and I'm going to show you every step of the way. So let's get started. Starting with the really simple stuff, I'm going to take my 10mm socket on my impact driver and remove this bracket located on the side of the knuckle. This holds the ABS wire and the brake caliper line to the knuckle, and then I'll remove those out of the way. Next, using my 8mm socket, I'll remove the bolt that holds the ABS sensor into the knuckle and pull that out. There is a rubber O-ring on this sensor that keeps dust and debris out, so just be careful, give it a little twist, and you should be able to pull it out without damaging it. Next, I'm going to remove the two 18mm bolts that hold the caliper to the knuckle. Now, this isn't a necessary step, but it is going to make things easier when I'm pulling the knuckle assembly off. I'm going to remove my caliper followed by my rotor. I've got an 18mm swivel on my impact gun, but a ratchet and socket will work just as well. Now I can hang my caliper off to the side and pull my rotor off. I'm just using a caliper hook to hold this off to the side, but you can also use a bungee cord if you have one available. Now I'll take my 36mm socket and remove my axle. Next, I'm going to take my 21mm socket and remove the nut for the sway bar end link. So I broke this nut loose with my impact gun, but noticed that as I was doing so, the ball joint boot was beginning to spin, and if I had kept going, it would tear. So now what I'm going to do is take my 21mm wrench or ratcheting wrench with a 6mm Allen socket to hold the nut or hold the stud in place, and then I can start removing the nut by hand. Moving on to my outer tie rod nut, I'll take my 21mm socket again and remove that from the knuckle. Because I'm going to give this boss a couple of taps with a hammer, I'm going to just loosely install my nut to protect my threads. Just like I did for the outer tie rod end, I'm going to take an 18mm ratcheting wrench and remove the nut for the upper ball joint, or for the upper control arm. Once again, I'll leave it loosely on there while I give it a couple taps with a hammer to break the ball joint loose. Using my 21mm socket, I can do the same thing on the lower ball joint. While I'm down here, I'll take my 18mm socket and remove the two nuts for the bottom of the strut assembly. With our axle nut removed and all of our ball joints broken loose, now we can begin to remove the knuckle assembly from the vehicle. It's not a bad idea to just get all the nuts started back onto the threads just to make sure you keep everything straight. You might have to give the axle a couple taps with a hammer just to get the splines to break loose while you remove the knuckle, but just be very careful not to damage the threads. Because I need to loosen up these lower control arm bolts in order to make my lower control arm swing down far enough for me to remove my strut, I'm going to take a paint pen and I'm going to mark on the camber caster bolt adjustments just so that I have a rough idea of where everything was when I go to put it back together. I'm going to do this on both sides of both bolts. Using a 24mm socket for my nut side and a 21mm wrench on my bolt side, I'm going to loosen up the lower control arm bolts and swing the lower control arm down and out of my way. Now I've got all these nuts removed, I can work my way up to the top of the strut assembly. I'm gonna take a 15mm ratcheting wrench and I'm gonna work out the 3 nuts on top of the strut. I'm gonna start with the one in the back just because it's the hardest one to get to, and then I'll work my way to the other 2 in the front. Now I'll use my pry bar to pull down on the lower control arm and get the strut assembly to pop free. My lower control arm will swing all the way down, and then I can pull the strut out. With my strut assembly removed from my Bronco, I've got it mounted up here in my bench vise because I need to remove the 2 lower strut studs. Now this isn't necessary because these studs are not going to be reused. However, I'm going to take an M12 by 1.75 nut and just thread it onto the ends of the studs. It gives me a nice broad surface to hit with my hammer, and it also protects the threads in the process should I ever need to reuse them or reinstall them. And now just repeat that for the other stud. Now we're ready to install our spacer plates on top of our strut assembly. There are 4 drilled holes in these plates. The 4th smaller hole is to align with the alignment pin on the top of the strut. Just slide that into place and then take your 2nd plate and do the same exact thing. Now I'm ready to reinstall my strut assembly to the vehicle. I'm going to line it up with the alignment pin here on the top of the strut, and then I'll use the provided lock nuts that come with the kit. Now that I have those nuts loosely installed, I'm going to line up the bottom area and then I will tighten them all up with a 17mm wrench. So I left the upper strut nuts loose so that I have all of this wiggle room here on the bottom of the strut. Now I can take the provided spacer, I'm going to put it underneath the strut and sandwich it in between the strut and the lower control arm, and then I'm going to install the provided nuts and bolts into the spots where I removed those studs. Now I have all of my strut hardware loosely installed. I'm gonna go in with a 17mm wrench and tighten down the hardware that I installed at the top of the strut. Now using a 19mm wrench to hold the top of the bolt, I'll take my 18mm socket on my impact gun and tighten down the lower strut nuts. With my strut hardware tightened up, I can now begin to reinstall my knuckle assembly. I have to line everything up, my axle, my lower ball joint, as I'm putting it into place to make sure I don't damage any components as they're going back in. I'll just loosely install the nuts on the axle nut and lower ball joint just to keep everything in place while I work on the outer tie rod and the upper ball joint. Now I can line up my outer tie rod and start the nut. Next, I can line up my upper ball joint. You might need a little bit of leverage for this, so I've got a pry bar handy. Just hook it into one of the coils on the spring and push down on the upper control arm while you line up the boss. And then once you have that started, you can throw the nut on. I'm going to start by tightening up my upper ball joint nut using my 18mm ratcheting wrench, but I'm also going to use an 8mm socket on my ratchet to hold the end of the stud in place so that it doesn't spin while I try to tighten it up. Once I have that snug and seated in place, I can go back and tighten it to the manufacturer's specifications. Moving on to my outer tie rod with my 21mm socket, I will snug it down with my impact and then torque it to spec. Doing the same thing with my 21mm socket, I can tighten the nut for the lower ball joint. While I'm down here tightening up all of my ball joint nuts, I can reinstall the nut for my sway bar end link and tighten it down with a 21mm socket. Using the same precaution I did when removing this nut, I'll take my 21mm ratcheting wrench and 6mm Allen socket to hold everything in place so I can prevent the boot from spinning and tearing. Once it's seated enough to hold, I can go back and torque it to spec. Now I can take my 36mm axle socket and snug and seat the axle into place before I go back and torque it down. Now that I have my knuckle reinstalled and my bolts and nuts are all torqued to spec, I can go ahead and reinstall my rotor, then my caliper, and my lines and brackets. I'm just going to use a lug nut to hold this in place while I reinstall my caliper. Now I can go ahead and reinstall my caliper. Just make sure that your lines are not twisted up. Slide your caliper over your rotor. Reinstall your caliper bolts and then torque them to the manufacturer's specification. Just going to start my caliper bolts by hand, snug them up with my 18mm impact socket, and then I'll go back and torque them down. Now I can reinstall my ABS wheel speed sensor. Once again, being careful not to damage the O-ring. Just give it a little twist and push into place and reinstall the 8mm headed bolt. Finally, we can reinstall our brake line ABS bracket to the side of the knuckle and tighten it down with a 10mm socket. So for this final step, we need to tighten up the lower control arm bolts. Now you would want to do this with the vehicle sitting on its weight, so with the wheels and tires installed and the vehicle down on the ground sitting on its weight, so that this suspension is fully loaded and the lower control arm bushings are in their resting position. I'm going to take my 24mm wrench on the nut side and my 21mm wrench on the bolt side, and I'm going to line up those marks that I made earlier with my paint pen. Once I have them pretty much where I want them, I can start tightening down the nut. Now, again, you would want to do this with the vehicle sitting down on its weight and the lower control arms in their resting position. But for the sake of this video, I just want to show you what I'm doing and how I'm doing it to show you the best way. Now that all of your components are reinstalled, do a good visual inspection to make sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be, and then go back and make sure everything is torqued to spec with a proper torque wrench. Once you've done that, you can repeat the same exact process on the other side of the vehicle and then take it for a professional alignment. So I'm going to show you how to remove the front and rear crash bars from your Bronco. Now we're working on a Badlands trim package, which is going to have some differences from the other trim levels, but the process is basically the same. I'm going to show you how to get these bolts out and how to pull out the front and rear crash bars to make room for bigger tires or a different bumper. The tools needed to remove this crash bar are a ratchet, a 15mm ratcheting wrench, and a T40 Torx bit. So as I mentioned, we're working on a Badlands trim package, which comes from the factory with a modular front bumper, which allows you to unbolt sections of the front bumper from the total assembly. I'm going to start by removing these two screws with a T40 Torx bit here at the top of the bumper to get this to loosen up, and then I'm going to move on to a couple other screws in the front. That's going to allow me to move this wing to the side and make room for my crash bar to come out. Next, I'm going to come to the inside edge of this opening and cut out in the bumper, and I'm going to loosen up these 3 Torx head screws. I'm just going to loosen them, and that's going to allow this wing to move out just far enough for me to get clearance for my crash bar. Once again, I'm using a T40 Torx bit socket just like I used for the other hardware. Now I'm going to come in with a 15mm ratcheting wrench, and I'm going to loosen and remove these 2 screws that hold in the front crash bar. And with my bumper wing loosened up and moved out of my way, that should give me the clearance I need to slide this right out. Now I can reinstall my 2 previously removed screws and tighten them up with my T40 Torx, and then I will tighten up the 3 loosened up T40 Torx head screws after that. Moving on to the rear crash bar, once again using my 15mm ratcheting wrench, I'm going to loosen and remove the 2 bolts, and then I can slide it right out. And that's going to wrap up this review and install of the Rough Country 1-inch front leveling kit fitting your 21 to 22 Ford Bronco without the Sasquatch package. Thanks for watching, and for all things Bronco, keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.